I find it's no good whatsoever. I know some poets do that, but it's no good whatsoever by sitting down saying, I'm now going to write a poem. If I feel I haven't written a poem for a while, you'll sit down, it doesn't work. But what happens when it does work, from time to time, is that a line with a bit of some sort of rhythm or other, or perhaps two lines, come into my head from heaven knows where. I mean, and I very often don't know what's all this about. I feel that there's a poem, something's coming, but what is it? And then gradually there's a kind of accretion of other bits to this thing, and then I start to jot it down. I don't have, this is a working practice some writers have, poets I know like Larkin and Geoffrey Hill, Peter Porter, they all had proper workbooks which they wrote in, solid things. I can't do that. I've got to have little sort of school exercise books, cheap things that I do things. Anything big, grand, I can't, it inhibits me. Often they're just bits of paper. And I write these things down, and gradually I hope that more bits will come. Until there comes a stage when I feel, yes, there is a poem here, and I sit down and sort of put the bits together. Sounds very crude, doesn't it? I mean, but it's not something that I can rationally... On the whole, I think I'm a pretty rational person, but it's not something that I can rationally explain what happens. It's a mystery to me, and it always has been. I've been writing poems since I was 14. And I'm now 83, and I still don't know how things work really.
What drew you initially when you were 14 to writing?
Well, after the whole business of not liking it, in fact finding it, I mean, I loved some things. I loved a lot of, I loved natural history, I loved archaeology, lots of books. I was a great reader. But poetry for various reasons. I mean, Miss Copley doing her slowly, silently out of the moon business, and my father trumpeting these poems. Macaulay, I mean, Macaulay's very good, entertaining, but my father used to recite these things and made me feel embarrassed, slightly sweaty. Well, one day in England, this is when I come back from America, when I was 14, going up to 15, the English teacher, a man called Ingram, was a very good teacher, tough, sort of coached the hockey and rugby teams and so on, but he was very, very good at exciting one's interest in all kinds of things. He came in and started talking about Anglo-Saxon riddle poetry. He read us some in translation and some in the original. And I was rather taken with these. I think it was part of my interest in archaeology, really, that was enlivened by this. And the sort of thing I'm talking about is I am round and made of iron and leather, and though the sword bites into me, I am not wounded. And the answer is a battle shield, and this sort of thing. Lots of them. They're very popular nowadays. People write them in schools, rather like haiku. But this wasn't so in 1945, whenever it was. Anyway, Ingram talked about these riddles, read some of them, and so on. And we were set for our task. It was to write an Anglo-Saxon riddle ourselves. A riddle poem. And I wrote about 6. And Ingram and Anthony Thwaites were by far the best of these. And immediately I thought, I'm a poet. And I began reading poetry, voluntary for the first time in my life, and writing it. Reams of stuff, I mean, all imitative, as it was bound to be at that stage. I mean, Rupert Brooke early on. Rupert Brooke was a great influence on my very first poems. But then, when I was 15, coming up to 16, I suppose, I read T.S. Eliot, The Wasteland. I never heard of him, but this thing. I was absolutely staggered. This was the most marvellous stuff I'd ever read in my life. I couldn't understand what was going on, but that was part of it. It was a huge mystery, but it was great stuff. And soon after, I wrote an enormous long poem myself called Ginnungagap. Ginnungagap is the word in Norse mythology for the chaos before the world began, before creation. And I don't know where I got that from, but Ginnungagap. Anyway, I wrote this poem called Ginnungagap, which is just like a sort of 16th carbon copy of The Wasteland, with notes at the end in foreign languages and things. Amazing. Anyway, I wrote massive stuff, and I was influenced by Rupert Brooke, T.S. Eliot. Somebody I got on to when I was 17 who was very dominant was, I don't know what you feel about it, was George Barker.
Oh yeah.
Very powerful, you know, the generation after Auden, the Dylan Thomas, George Barker, David Gascon generation. I discovered him by chance reading George Barker, and he bowled me over too. I was a follower of George Barker for years. And so it went on. Yeah, it went on sort of reading and writing, and that was it. And poetry became the centre. I mean, archaeology too, I'm still fascinated, still am. But poetry became the real centre. I mean, not that I ever thought that I could earn a living.
What about at university? I mean,
yes, very active there.
Yeah.
Writing a lot and so on. Well, I'd published, you see, when I came up, I was quite old really when I came to university, because I'd had to do my 2 years army service, and I was messing around getting my Latin, which was necessary for Oxford in those years. So I was 22 by the time I came to Oxford to do English, and I was, you know, fairly grown up, I suppose. And quite quickly my poems were published in undergraduate magazines, and some of them in, you know, well, I was still an undergraduate, in the Spectator and the New Statesman and the TLS and places like that. So I was beginning to be known as a poet, you know, then, and also reviewing in the Spectator and whatnot. I was quite a sort of pushy lad, and I was very involved in the sort of literary scene at Oxford. I was editor of the weekly magazine, the ISIS, and that's where I met Ant through that, and helping run the University Poetry Society and editing the annual anthology, Oxford Poetry, and so on. So I was very involved in the literary scene, the poetry scene at Oxford. And then immediately got married to Anne and went off to Japan to teach, and that's it. And that's where I wrote most of the poems, I suppose, in my first book, Home Truths, which was published in 1957. But some of them, I suppose one or two of them were written in Oxford, the poems in that book. There's one, I think it's probably, yes, the very first poem, I think, in time, as it were, is the first poem in my collected poems. Oedipus, yes. Well, I think that was, yes, that was written when I was in Oxford. And it was published in the London Magazine, when the London Magazine was edited by John Lehman.
Maybe you could read that.
Well, I mean, I think it's not a bad poem, but I don't think it sounds like me at all. I don't know what it sounds like. Oedipus. If she who first embodied me, from swollen fetus crouched beneath hot sallow blood and milk, if she speaks through your eyes, tastes of your breath, then hide me where I cannot see. For when you spoke, it was her face which looked through mists of flesh and age and saw a child. In your embrace I trudged a lifetime's pilgrimage from prince's birth to king's disgrace. I snuggle in your belly, you who banish all love's doubts but this, can never see what sickness grew under the sweet drug of your kiss, who buckled on a cripple's shoe. Held fast against your breast, I find a shapeless memory take shape upon the pillow. Heart and mind blunt both my eyes in blind escape, and when I waken, I am blind. Well, it's quite strong stuff, but I honestly can't remember a thing about writing it.
And
It doesn't sound like me, does it?
But quite technically accomplished, isn't it? You know, with the five line verses.
Well, it
and
rhymes.
The rhyme schemes
Yes,
and the.
yes.
It's largely written in a sort of iambic meter.
Yes,
isn't it?
yes,
You
yes,
know?
it is, yes.
But you varied it, haven't you? It's rhythmically quite
Yes.
varied.
I think I wrote much, in those days, much tighter poems than I do now. They're very clenched. That's a word that Tom Gunn used of some of his poems. They're very clenched. I think it's a good word. Boom.